Thank you. Yeah, excellent, brilliant. Yeah.
Okay, everyone. Sorry that we're starting late. We were expecting about 70 people. I think the traffic may have got in the way of some of them, and possibly getting out of London for the weekend may have got in the way of others. But I'm very pleased that you've all come. We've got a really interesting session, a very distinguished and, more importantly, interesting group of speakers. And the topic of conversation, I think, is particularly interesting because it just brings together, at least in my mind, a number of interesting issues, starting off with the local economic development area, which is clearly the main subject we're going to be discussing, but also located in the country of Colombia, in the city of Medellin, and I'm sure some of you here are going to be Latinists, what's the word, Latinistas, or Colombianists rather than experts on local economic development. Others may be experts on local economic development. Hopefully we'll see both of those issues coming out. I'll introduce each of the panelists in more detail when it comes to their turn, but I'd like to thank them very much for coming. And let's start off with Milford. Milford, let me get my biography. Milford's a research fellow at ODI and has worked a lot on especially microfinance. Some of you may have seen his provocative writings on microfinance. He's worked in the Balkans, Eastern Europe, Middle East, China, South Africa, and including Colombia. And I think you're going to be working especially in Colombia from now on. So if you'd like to start.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. The research that we're reporting on here is as a result of several trips to Medellin, starting a couple of years ago, but mainly we're reporting on the research that we did in February on a 3-week trip there. And the work really starts from looking at the way the whole of Latin America has changed and what can we learn from the past 20 or 30 years of experience, and because they have undergone many a transition in the last 10 years, almost on a par with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there's a lot of exciting things changing. And what really struck me about the city of Medellin was the way that they were developing what seemed to be a very interesting local city level model of development. And so I was very intrigued to find out more, and the more I found out about it, the more I wanted to find even more about it. So that's really what we're researching and what we're reporting on now. Very quickly, for those, just a very little bit of background about Colombia itself, and many of you will know a lot more about this than me. A violent period in the 1950s and 60s, then gave way to narco industry, paramilitary violence in the 1970s and 1980s. So not a very peaceful 40 years for Colombia. Then a sort of a peace came around in the 1990s, bringing the narco cartels under control and the paramilitaries under control, and things started to get a little bit better. And in terms of economic development, the foundations were being laid for a much more sustainable trajectory. In particular, in Medellin, there is a long tradition of textiles and heavy and light industry. So it was historically always one of the more developed cities in Colombia and in Latin America. At one stage, it was called the Manchester of Latin America because of its strong foundation in textiles. This, of course, declined in the 1980s and 90s, partly because of the violence, but partly because of the rise of East Asia. And then taking its place was really a construction-led boom, but that was mainly because of the narco profits being recycled into the construction industry. So they have a very strong construction industry. So things have really worked out, have got a little bit better over the last decade or so. But having said that, we are still facing huge poverty, deprivation and inequality really are the defining features of Medellin in the 1990s and today. Now, Medellin's response in the 1990s, there was a realization across Latin America that the Washington consensus or neoliberal policy model was really not creating the foundations for sustainable or equitable growth. And this was recognized as much in Colombia as many other countries. And many of the researchers working in Colombia were finding that it was having a very negative impact in terms of the main criteria that they were looking at in terms of private accumulation. Poverty was rising. Inequality, Colombia I think is second only to Brazil in terms of inequality, and social deprivation. And of course, most researchers has found that this underpins the violence there, so the one feeds off the other. So there's a general feeling that a new development model was needed, and a more balanced, a more pro-poor economic and social development model in order to include the previously excluded sections of society in the development model and in the hopeful success going forward. And there was also an understanding that there was a need to rebuild the institutional fabric in Medellin and in Colombia widely, because moving into the institutional economics tradition, we know that strong institutions, well-governed, accountable, transparent institutions are really quite fundamental to sustainable and equitable local economic and sustainable development. There was also, in the aftermath of many decades of conflict and poverty-driven conflict, there was a need to begin to accumulate accumulations of solidarity and social capital. This was the glue that was going to bring the communities together. So that the only way to do that was to reintroduce this idea of social capital and get people to understand that a better future was possible by working together rather than taking up arms against each other. So what seems to happen in the late 1990s, what you can, looking back now, we can see that the elements of what we might call today a local developmental state approach began to emerge in Medellin. Now, the developmental state up to now has usually been a national economic phenomena. You'll be aware of the works of Peter Evans and Robert Wade and Alice Amsden, Ha-Joon Chang, people like that who've looked at why the developmental state at the national level was important in East Asian development. But there's also a side literature which looks at why this was important at the local level as well. And so this seems to have been what we can see now with the benefit of hindsight of what they started to develop in Medellin in the 1990s. And a couple of factors were important. One issue was community ownership of the biggest, or one of the biggest enterprises in the region, which was the power generating complex. And taking this into public community ownership, city ownership, was important because it's well managed and it's profitable, and 30% of the profits basically go into the city coffers for economic and social programs. Now, this is a model that has been pioneered in other parts of Latin America. We've seen it in Chile, for example, with Codelco, the big copper, the world's biggest or second biggest copper producer, which is basically state-owned, and it's been able to finance the Chilean state as it's decided to enter into different types of economic development, social development programs. So that was the sort of model, it seems. Also, community-driven infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure. So they have a very well-developed metro system connecting the various communities. And the most innovative, and what most people know about Medellin, is the ski lifts that basically connect the barrio communities. Very cheap, very affordable, and people can basically connect with each other in the poorest communities, and also they can connect with each other with the idea of doing business. So this is something that's quite new. Many people are aware of the cash grant programs that seem to be sweeping a lot of Latin America. Well, Medellin also established its own Medellin Solidaria, which was a cash grant program for the poor barrios. And the final aspect, this is the area that I'm particularly interested in, what was called the Cultura E program, which was about trying to include the poorest communities around Medellin in the idea of moving forward through enterprise development. As we all know, enterprise development has been raised up as some sort of solution to poverty and undevelopment, and in many ways that's a correct interpretation. But the poor don't often get included for various reasons. So this was about bringing the poor into the enterprise development trajectory. Two institutions we looked at when we went to Medellin, which were quite important. The first one is the SEDESA, which is a business support agency financed by the city government, and it has a mandate to develop micro-enterprises, all small or medium, but most of them are micro-enterprises, owned by the poorest in the community. An important aspect is that it has secure funding. So it basically is tasked with working for the benefit of the community rather than, if it was a private consultancy, working for the benefit of its own survival and its own development and its shareholders or whatever. So it works for the benefit, the long-term benefit of the community. Another institution, which is the partner institution to the SEDESO, is the Banco de las Oportunidades, which is a microfinancial institution. And it provides low-cost microloans to the poor, and in general, no collateral is required. So the idea was that these two institutions working in tandem would be able to kickstart some sort of micro-enterprise development trajectory in the poorest communities. Now, the results to date, some modest outputs to date. There have been some new jobs, new income streams for the poor. Generally, it's just very small numbers of the entrepreneurial poor that have been involved. It has been able to create some links, going back to the transport links. It has been able to build upon those transport links to link some people in the barrio, the poorer communities, with the richer communities down in the valley where the real demand actually lies for the sorts of goods and services that typically micro-enterprises can produce. So they've made some efforts in linking the two communities together. Another important thing that really came out of a lot of the interviews we did was this issue of confidence. It's a sign that they're doing something. Things are happening, things are improving. Seems to be something that is an output of what they've done to date. However, there are some issues with the modelling. It's gone far, but it hasn't actually perhaps gone far enough. So one of the issues we looked at, and it's a key issue, that the idea of working with micro-enterprises is effectively no solution. Now, why is that? Because working in poor communities that are already pretty much saturated with the sorts of simple, non-tradable goods and services produced by the poor, actually adding to the volume of these micro-enterprises actually just leads to displacement effects, which is basically you're knocking out existing capacity. So when you look at the community level, I mean, you can always find individual examples of somebody who did good and who did quite well at what they were doing. But at the community level, you find that displacement effects. So somebody coming with a new coffee bar basically puts out the guy next door with a coffee bar. So it's that sort of, and it leads to what we call job churn. So job churn is in effect the defining characteristic of these very poor communities rather than a sort of a sustainable development trajectory. Another aspect, when you look at the clients that have been worked with, is the high failure rate. And this is true of all small businesses, particularly micro businesses, and particularly in the very poorest community. The failure rate is very high indeed. And why should we be surprised? We shouldn't be surprised because they're generally undercapitalized. They're working in markets which are already saturated, very low skills, etc., etc. So we shouldn't be surprised. But why that's important is that people who take the route out of poverty, the supposed route out of poverty through micro-enterprises, often find that they hit the brick wall in a year's time. They lose the assets that they invested in these micro-enterprises, plus they lose social capital within the community, they lose reputations, they also might lose their assets that they pledged to repay these loans, land, apartments, housing, that sort of thing. So they many of them end up actually in a worse position than before they entered into this whole idea. We also found that the SEDESOs really need to put a lot more effort into converting the existing micro into small. This was a very time-consuming and a complicated thing to do, to take micro-enterprises producing very simple goods and services and somehow turn them into small. In general, there isn't really a bridge between the two. You can't take a tomato seller in the street and then somehow turn her into a tomato processor. I mean, that bridge exists in neoclassical theory. It doesn't actually exist in practice to an extent. They really need to look at the non-local aspects of developing. So if you have some good business people, they need to not focus on local demand. There's more of an issue, there's more of a potential focusing on non-local demand, but they need the support services to do that. And that's an area where really they're not geared up to supporting. The gendered outcomes, I'll leave Kate to talk more about them, but just do very quickly ones. There was a clear sign of ghettoization, that the way towards solving the issue of poverty, gendered poverty, was to create micro businesses. And that clearly had some, it was more leading towards disempowerment than actual empowerment or an exit out of poverty. And maybe the idea of loading up women with jobs there, you've got household responsibilities, reproductive, and then plus they have to work in some micro-enterprise, then that seems to be a problematic solution. Now, a key one, that an idea was that they really need to work with small businesses, which we mean by small businesses which have innovation potential, which can scale up, which can address non-local demand patterns. And really the Sedesos were not in a position to help those particular type of businesses. Quite apart from the fact that many of the clients in these poorest communities are not the sort of people that can move into these types of business areas. They lack the skills, they lack the market contacts, they lack the personal contacts to get into those sorts of areas. So we're onto a hiding to nothing in many respects. But the Sedesos didn't really have the capacity to help these people into those types of jobs. And of course, the financial support system, the Banca Los Oportunidades, was basically geared up to a couple of $1,000s, basically for micro enterprises rather than the more onerous demands of small enterprises. So just a quick one, is this the key conundrum in marginalized poor communities? So we know that one of the big issues when you're trying to develop enterprises is the issue of the lack of demand. Poor communities, by definition, have a lack of demand. People are poor, they don't have money to buy anything. So why would we expect that somehow we can go into those communities and try and sell additional things when one of the definitions of being poor is that there isn't any demand? So there's a real conundrum there. And what seems to be happening is that we're recycling poverty within the community rather than eradicating it. Now, this is something that people like Mohamed Yunus and Hernando de Soto, Dambisa Moyo more recently, have argued that micro-enterprises can have a future servicing local demand. Well, I think that really is not a logical way out of poverty, and certainly that's what we found in the barrio communities there. So it's more about redistributing poverty within the community rather than eradicating it. This goes back to the old issue in economics of the fallacy of composition, that because we can see one person who may have made a success of their micro-business, we cannot then extrapolate to say, well, we just need to have everybody doing the same business. There's a real problem of understanding that, and it's a real barrier to development in the poorest communities. So finally, the required response, well, we need to, one of the issues we looked at with one of the business support groups that was going on there, Pro Antioquia, was this issue of relocalizing demand. So a lot of the big businesses in Medellin don't actually work with the local businesses. They want to develop supply chains, but they don't know how to. They don't think there's the capacity to react to the contracts they might give. So a lot more work needs to be done on relocalizing and really working to develop a local supply chain. There's a lot of good experience out there in terms of the Japanese economy, in terms of the South Korean economy, Taiwan, of relocalizing demand and having large companies or even medium companies building a local supply chain. This wasn't evident in Medellin. The big companies were complaining that they can't subcontract locally. So there's an institutional gap there. Some institution needs to actually put the two together. The Sedesos, we found they need to focus more on sustainable enterprises rather than just having poor people coming into the Sedeso and saying, I'm in poverty, can I create a micro-enterprise? I think they need to be an issue, there's a social side of supporting these particular people, but entrepreneurship is not the default setting. In a sense, it's the exception rather than the default setting for some of these people. The Sedesos actually need to work with sustainable enterprises. So that begs the question, they need the technical capacities to be proactive and developmental in what they do, focusing upon the longer term, developing businesses with a potential. It's risky, but there's a lot of good experience in how it works. The financial aspect is critical to developing enterprises because if you don't have the right financial package there, basically the whole idea stops right there. So we were discussing with the financial sector there, and clearly the bank Los Oportunidades needs to develop more funding streams in terms of development finance. That's working with small businesses which have a different need than, say, micro enterprises, which is all about short-term funding. They can get away with high interest rates. But we're talking about a much more specialized package. There's been some good experience in the past, some bad experience in the past, but these boil down to, in many cases, issues of governance. Can we get the right financial institutions to do this? What are the keys to these? Some countries have been very successful. Northern Italy, the Germans, Northern Spain, Brazil, in working with these types of financial packages. Others haven't been so successful. But it's probably a governance issue that needs to be addressed there. Now, one thing we found was that Medellin is actually quite institutionally thick. Lots of different institutions working on the development question, but not real coordination between them. So this came out in quite a few of the interviews, that people were doing parallel programs, or we need to do this, but they didn't know that somebody else was doing it. So there needs to be some sort of strategic planning capacity there. But still, this issue of planning, the word is still a bit of a dirty word in many countries, but clearly there needs to be some sort of strategic planning capacity at the local level, and interaction between these institutions. Boiling down, Medellin needs a local industrial policy. It needs a strategic plan as to how it's going to develop the sort of comparative advantages it has today, but also to develop new comparative advantages which we're not aware of, but which they might be able to move into. So they need some sort of strategic planning capacity. My conclusion then is that Medellin has a very impressive industrial and agricultural past, and there's lots of potential for the future. It's gone down a bit of a blind alley with its adherence to a sort of Washington consensus type local policy models, which didn't really do anything, didn't really address the key problems there. So, but they've made interesting progress in developing an alternative at the local level. We don't know how far this is going to go, but it's being called social urbanism, that's one aspect of it, or the local developmental state, but it's certainly an interesting model. It has some achievements to date. As I noted, confidence and solidarity, and the sense that things are being done and things are being worked on. But our overall conclusion, at least of the research I did, was that we really need to extend and deepen the institutions that are working in Medellin, and upgrade their capacity to do things in the community. So it's too early to say that they've been very successful, but it's not too early to say they've been successful enough. They are making things happen, and they really just need more resources and more attention to move forward. So I think a positive model, and we've had many brick walls in the past, and models then for some reason explode and don't go any further. But I think there's something interesting there that we've seen.